welcome once again to the upper room. So glad you've joined us. You know, not too far from here in a little community called Fruta. It's actually not that small anymore. Back in 1945, September 10th to be exact, something extraordinary happened. And it wouldn't have been extraordinary without what happened after this event. There was a rooster pecking in the dirt, and it was decided by the Olsons, Mr. and Mrs. Olson, that it was time for that rooster to go into the chicken heaven pot to be eaten. And so Mr. Olson went out and chopped his head off. And you know, you've heard of, running around like a chicken without your head. That can happen with chickens. I've seen it, but there's a limited time for that to happen. Not in this case. This chicken, believe it or not, did not cease to live anytime in the next, get this, 18 months. 18 months! To make a long story short, that chicken became famous, so famous that there's a monument to that chicken in downtown Fruta. That chicken, living another 18 months, actually, you won't believe this, actually went on tour. It was put in the World Guinness Book Records. They took this chicken, this headless chicken, they named him Mike. So Mike the Headless Chicken went on tour in New York City, Atlantic City, Los Angeles, San Diego. People paid 25 cents a person to see this phenomenon. Now, 25 cents a person back in 1945, that was a decent change. And so people paid to see Mike the Headless Chicken. It was amazing. Time magazine did a special of maybe Newsweek, I don't know. But this chicken was the rage for 18 months. So Mike the Headless Chicken became famous. And he's famous to this day, actually. There is a festival in Fruta, and they bring in rock bands. It's a 2 or 3 day event. Isn't that amazing? Mike the Headless Chicken. Sadly, it all ended in Arizona as they were coming back from one of their tours, and they stopped at a hotel in the desert in Arizona for the night. And what I hadn't told you is Mr. Olson would keep him alive by taking an eyedropper and, putting fluids and food down his esophagus. And he said, for a headless chicken, he became pretty robust. He grew from 2.5 pounds to 8 pounds. But back to his demise. So they're in this hotel in Arizona, and all of a sudden, Mr. Olson starts to hear Mike choking. What choked the chicken? I don't know, but it was the end for Mike. Now, why all this about Mike the Headless Chicken? I gotta tell you, the more I learned about Mike, the more I thought, and I know this is gonna offend some people, and maybe that's why I'm saying this, the more I thought about the modern church. I mean, what's the deal? What does the modern church have to do with this famous chicken? I honestly believe that the modern church is living in a way that it may look robust, it may look healthy, but it really is living as though there's no head. We're going to talk about that. We're doing this special lesson today. We're going to call it kind of the 6-month checkup for the upper room. We've been in existence officially about 6 months, a little over 6 months. And I just want to pause and say, so where are we? Okay, let's talk about why we got here and how we got here a little bit, but more than anything, where are we now after 6 months? You're a part of this. Many of you, some of you watching are not a part of the upper room. We would hope that you would find your way into a small faith community. But what is really going on, and why did we even begin to go down this road over 6 months ago? Again, I say Mike the Headless Chicken, I think, is a key metaphor for this. Because what we see going on in the modern Western church, to be honest with you, is a little unnerving. Barna Research, and I know I call on Barna Research a lot, but they do great research on what's actually happening in our culture and in the church. One of their recent researches came out with the fact that only 6% of people who have attended churches said that in their recent attendance of a church they heard anything about God or Jesus, that they learned anything about God or Jesus. I don't know what your perspective on discipleship is. As you know, Jesus talked more about being a disciple than about almost anything else. And my perspective on it is that it's a lifelong journey from the point you come to know Jesus to be trained to be like him, to honor him. But it's a training process where your life becomes an arrangement of priorities and learning opportunities to have your life change to become like him. Again, Barna research says that only 20% of people in the church have ever been discipled. That makes me wonder what is going on in the modern Western church, which led us to this place we're at. We're saying, no, maybe some adjustments need to be made. So you might be saying, Steve, that metaphor of the headless chicken, I'm not flying with it, because chickens don't fly. Let me take you to Colossians chapter 1, starting in verse 15. The Son, meaning Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Okay, we've talked about this before. He is the focus of the entire universe. Now watch this. Verse 18, Colossians 1, and he is the head of the body, the church. Now, are you hanging with my metaphor? What if Jesus has been removed? Not in all churches, and I know it's a generalization, but how can only 6% of people who attend church say that, yeah, the last time or two that I attended a church, I heard about Jesus or God? Unless maybe somehow the head has come off, at least in our perspective. Now, in reality, he will always be the head of the church, but if we have removed his head and we continue to run around like Mike, and everyone is marveling at how robust we look, how many people attend church, how big our buildings are, and yet the head is not there, what happens? So I want to offer up this as a discussion question. Would you discuss the possibilities that, generally speaking, in the modern Western church, the head has come off, at least in how we do church? That if we are so busy running around, but we seldom talk about Jesus. Jesus is seldom the topic of conversation. Is it possible? Would you have that discussion? Now, if you'll allow me, I'd like to go back to Barna one more time. A research they did just last year, 2020, found this. Those who frequent worship services do so largely because of personal enjoyment. But many churchgoers also readily admit that they believe people are tired of church as usual. So it's about personal enjoyment, but they're getting tired of that. And one more thing that they found, and that is amongst church attenders, 65% of those believe that they go to church because they enjoy it. And that's church attenders. How about those who consider themselves Christians? 85% of Christians say they attend church because they enjoy it. Now, what's missing? Can I ask? What's missing in those studies? Was there any mention of Jesus? In all the research I hear no mention of Jesus. What did Colossians tell us? Jesus is the head. Is it possible, I want to ask you again, that the head has been removed from the modern Western church? And if so, what do we do about that? 2 Timothy chapter 4 is Paul's last letter before he'll be beheaded. So it's his last words, so they're very significant. Not that any other words he wrote were insignificant. And here is what he says in chapter 4, verse 3. For a time is coming when people will no longer listen to sound and wholesome teaching. They will follow their own desires and will look for teachers who will tell them whatever their itching ears want to hear. They will reject the truth and chase after myths. I believe that that is exactly what's happening in the modern Western church. That we are chasing after myths. And one of those myths is that the church is about me and it's about my personal enjoyment. And that's what this research tells us. So what does Paul say we should do about this? I go on in verse 5. But you, okay, don't be like that. Don't look for teaching that just makes you feel good, because I can guarantee you some of this teaching right now is not making some of you feel good. You say, I grew up in this church. All my great memories are in this kind of a church. That's fine. Now, don't reduce yourself to wanting your ears itched. Listen to what he says. But you should keep a clear mind. Think clearly. My desire for you today in this lesson is for you to just commit yourself to thinking clearly. Not using emotion, feelings, all my memories, all those things. Think clearly about what we're saying. So he says, keep a clear mind in every situation. So in this situation, he goes on, don't be afraid of suffering. Work at telling others the good news and carry out the ministry God has given you. So that's what we're to do. I want to focus again on the clear thinking part of this. All right? We're not going to be afraid to suffer as things get a little testy in this culture against Christianity. But we are going to think clearly about this issue. We're coming to you from just outside of Paonia, Colorado. It's a little community. It's a beautiful community. We're about 2 miles from Paonia and about 7 miles from a little town called Hotchkiss. Let me tell you about what's going on here. It's really interesting. These two little communities have had their lifeblood be the mining industry. Okay, there's a coal mine. There's several coal mines just up the road. And for probably 100 years, I'm guessing, the coal mining industry is what fed these towns. You may know that the coal mining industry, at least around here, is shutting down. It's mostly shut down. So now what happens to these little towns? I want to tell you, they have a couple options. One is do nothing and probably die. All right? The other option is for them to adjust, for them to rethink or repurpose what their community is about. The talk is about them becoming retirement communities. And it's a beautiful place, and I could see that happening. Here's what's really interesting. We've played against these little towns in, sports over the years, and these two little towns are rivals, as you can imagine, just being 9 miles apart. Starting right now, this is baseball season, right now in baseball season, they are having to combine their teams. Can you imagine? Up until now, these kids couldn't stand each other. They were bitter enemies. Now they must practice on the same field, play on the same field, sit in the same dugout. This is going to take some adjusting, isn't it? Now, eventually they're going to combine these schools because there just aren't enough kids. And so not only will the athletes have to learn to play together, the entire school will become one school. It's just an example of how in life sometimes, because of what's going on in the culture, we need to make adjustments. And the reason I bring this up to you, and the reason I'm so glad we're here, isn't it a gorgeous setting, is because I want you to be thinking about the fact that these towns have an option here. And when it comes to the church, you and I have an option as well. And that's how we got to the upper room. As we looked at the modern Western church, what is typical now, exactly what I've told you, it seemed as though Jesus was missing. Not from everyone, not from every local church, but generally, he's less and less the center of the activities and the conversation and the teaching, I believe. And so we felt compelled by God to start the upper room, a very simple faith community that stays focused on Jesus, and we're compelled by his love is what we started with. If you go all the way back to video 1, lesson number 1 is, why are we doing this? Compelled by the love of Christ. That's the real reason. Okay, that motivates us, but there's another part to this, and that's what I've been talking about. We believe it's time to actually adjust. We think it's time to rethink. Some people would call it rebranding. I don't really like that term, but you know, there's a lot of cows around here, so let's say it's time to rebrand. And it's time to say, how can we adjust from what's happened to the modern church to get back to living what we see in the New Testament church? So it's not just me, but a lot of the folks in our upper room ministry are convinced that it's time to morph. It's time to morph not to something that pleases the culture, but actually morph back to what we originally find in the New Testament and in the New Testament church. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I was playing racquetball yesterday with my good friend Bill, and another guy joined us. His name is Patrick. Patrick is a defense attorney, so we had some good conversations about what that kind of life is like. And he told me a story I want to relate to you that I found really interesting. We were talking about some major construction going on some roads around here. And he said, you know, I once had a defendant that was charged with a crime. And so when I sat down to interview him and talk with him, and there are a few other people in the room, I said, okay, so tell me about your alibi, how you were not there for this crime. And he said, well, I've got a good alibi. He said, I work construction, road construction. He says, so for 18 straight hours, I can tell you, when that crime was committed, I had my hands on the steering wheel and the gear shifts of this heavy equipment on road construction. And when he said that, Patrick said, I couldn't help but burst out laughing, and the other people in the room started laughing. Now, why did they do that? Because, generally speaking, again, a lot of us have experience of driving by road construction crews, and there's no sense that they've been working for 18 straight hours, or that they're even working right now. Okay, if you work road construction, I'm sorry. But that was his reaction. That is the general opinion about a lot of people. That's how they see that line of work. So what Patrick was saying basically is, they don't have the greatest reputation for always being at work, right? You may have driven through a road construction crew that one guy's working, the rest of them are watching. So my question to you, and I want this to be a discussion question as well, what do you think is the reputation of the church today in this culture, in the modern Western culture? What do you think is the reputation? And don't hold back. Tell us what you actually think, all right? So having used the metaphor of the headless chicken Mike, let's go back and see what Jesus says about his church. Do you realize, this is really interesting, that Jesus only mentioned his church 3 times? Isn't that incredible? 3 times. Twice in the passage I'm about to read to you from Matthew chapter 18, and then once in another passage that we'll read together today. Because if we really want to keep Jesus as the head, as the focus of who we are, we need to know, what did he think about his church? So let's go to Matthew chapter 18, starting in verse 15. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you've won them over. There you go. Simple solution, right? But notice the relational factor and how important sin plays in relationships. But if they will not listen, take 1 or 2 others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. That's what they did in the court of law. So he says, let's apply that to our kingdom living. Verse 17, if they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. First of 3 times, Jesus says the church. The word, really important, we're going to really dive into this. The word is Ekklesia. Ekklesia, that's the word that would come out of his mouth. Actually, that's the Greek word that was written down. It was probably an Aramaic word, but it means the same as Ekklesia. And we're going to talk about what that exactly means. So tell it to the Ekklesia. And if they refuse to listen, even to the Ekklesia, there's the second time he talks about it, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be, or will have been, is the actual wording, bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. Okay, Jesus uses a phraseology here that the rabbis used, and that phraseology is pretty uncommon to us. You know, what is bound in heaven should be bound here, what is loosed in heaven. What it means is agree with how God does things. So if you look to heaven and say, God, how do you do things? Then agree to do that on earth is the idea. Okay, so he's saying God's perspective on this is really important. That sin in my community of people, and that's what Ekklesia means, we'll get deeper as I said into it, but sin is so tragic and so deplorable that we have to deal with it. So in verse 19, he'll finish this section by saying this, again, truly I tell you that if two of you on earth agree about anything they ask for, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. Now watch this last line, it's going to come into play later. For where two or three gather in my name, there am I with them. Okay, so what was the theme of this? He mentions Ekklesia, the church, twice. The theme is the health of his people. The health, the spiritual health of his people. The relational health. That when there is sin, it needs to be dealt with. That's very simple, very straightforward. And then he gives a process. By the way, that process, first of all, dealing with sin like this does not really happen in the modern Western church. And dealing with it in the process he gives us almost never happens in the modern Western church. Again, why? I believe it's because the head has been removed. We don't go to him to get the advice for how to deal with these issues. I had a book in my library for years. I don't know what I did with it. And I loved the book. It was a book about creativity. It was called A Whack on the Side of the Head. Okay? So, in other words, you need to see things differently. And that's what I implore for us today. That we would have a whack on the side of the head and we would begin to see things a little differently. You and I have a way of looking at the church that we've had all of our lives. It's going to take a readjustment. It's going to take a reevaluation. It's going to take something different for us to understand and perceive what Jesus had in mind as opposed to what we typically have in mind. So let's outline this. I think what we're about to understand is that there are kind of three, at least in these passages, three aspects of the Ekklesia that we need to pay attention to. Number one is its mobility. Okay. Number two is its mysterious nature. And number three, its matchless nature. Okay, let's start with its mobility. I would have thought, and see if you can agree with me on this, I would have thought that Jesus would have used a certain structure to explain what was going to happen to his people in the coming years, thousands of years. And it would have been something the Jews would have readily understood in a religious sense, either the synagogue or the temple. Okay? They are very familiar with that. Those are religious, faith-based institutions, if you will. And yet he doesn't. When he institutes his church, he does not refer to the synagogue or the temple. One of the reasons, I believe, most importantly, is that those are fixated structures. They cannot be mobile. Now, there's some things he held on to in regard to the synagogue and the temple, and that is the teaching about how to have faith, right? And the idea of relationships within the temple and the synagogue, and those are important. Those will carry over. But there is something that would not carry over, and I believe it's the idea of mobility. They would not be able to see the temple as a mobile kind of thing, right? When they walked out of the temple with Jesus, his disciples said, "Wow, Jesus, look at these stones. Isn't this an impressive building?" Jesus' response was not to be impressed, but rather to say, don't be impressed because this is all going to be torn down in 40 years. Okay, so the mobility factor is huge. He predicted this. It's Acts chapter 1. The last thing, really, he said before he left, verse 6, then they gathered around him and asked him, Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom of Israel? Remember, they're thinking of actually boundaries and military power and all that kind of thing. Jesus responds in verse 7, it is not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses, watch this, in Jerusalem, in all Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. What is he describing? You. will be mobile. You will take what I have given you and you will go with it. You won't get stuck in one place and think this is, where we live out what I've taught you. And we see this happening in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 5, where it says they moved around from house to house. They did not have a huge structure they all came to. It was a mobile thing. And that is kind of how we got to this place within the upper room. We need not to be stuck in one place. We move from house to house if possible, but it is a mobile thing, and we want to remain mobile because that's what his church actually does. Acts chapter 19, verse 10 tells us what Peter had to say after he had planted the church in Ephesus 2 years earlier. And he said this, "All who lived in the Roman province of Asia are hearing the word of the Lord." The Roman province of Asia. Everybody in Asia is hearing the word. That, historically, is over 1 million people are now hearing about Jesus. Why? Because of its mobility. And in Romans chapter 15, verse 19, he says this, "So from Jerusalem all the way around to Illyricum, I have fully proclaimed the gospel of Christ." That doesn't mean much to you and to me, but if you do the research, you find out that he's talking about an area of 300,000 square miles. That's what you call mobility, right? That's what you call, from now on, you're not going to sit in the same place doing the same thing all the time. You're going to take what I've taught you and you're going to go with it. And guess what? The Ekklesia did that, and they did that without any military presence, without any government support. They did it without paid staff, paid pastors, without facilities and campuses. They took the gospel to the ends of the earth without all the things that we say are essential. The first thing we get from Jesus is the mobility of his ecclesia. So Jesus uses a word for his church that was not a religious word at all. And it may have shocked his disciples when he called his church Ekklesia. And by using that word, he's using a word that the Greeks and Romans used all the time. And it had a very precise meaning. And from this, we're going to get the mysterious nature of the church, of the Ekklesia. The meaning of this word is called out. An assembly, a group of people who are called out. Now, Sir William Ramsay goes into great detail about this. And what he proclaims is that there was a word that was connected to Ekklesia, and the word was conventus. And conventus took place, get this, whenever 2 or 3 or more Roman citizens got together anywhere in the world. Now think about that. Anywhere in the world. Not in Rome necessarily, not in Palestine necessarily. Anywhere in the world, 2 or 3 Roman citizens came together. And when they came together, this concept is that the power and presence of Rome was there in their midst. And the protection of Rome as well. So you got the power, presence, protection of Rome whenever 2 or 3 are gathered. Does that sound familiar? Again, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 18, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am with them." My power, my presence, my protection is with them. So Jesus uses a secular, not a religious, a secular word, and he infuses, he pumps in, he saturates that word with kingdom DNA. Okay, so it's brilliant. They now understand things have changed. It's not about a building. It's not about a temple, a synagogue. It's about taking the kingdom ideas that God has given us through his Son and going with it. And then here's the mysterious part of it. And wherever we are, he's with us. Just like the Romans understood, wherever they were and they got with another Roman citizen, the power, presence, and protection of Rome is with us. It's a mysterious thing. And that's not the only mysterious thing. In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul goes into this conversation about husbands and wives and how they should interact, how they should treat each other. And he does this for several verses, and then he says, but the mystery is this, I'm actually talking about the Ekklesia. He uses that same word. It's a mystery that what we see in marriage, when it's done correctly, is actually what's supposed to be happening in the Ekklesia. It's a mysterious thing. So it's a mobile thing. It's about mobility. It's a mysterious thing, how we can gather anywhere, anytime, and he is with us. His presence, his power, and his protection is with us. So the mysterious nature of the Ekklesia is such that there's an edginess to it, isn't there? And it's kind of, well, what do you mean? What do you mean it's mysterious? There is a sense of adventure tied to it. If you can't see the adventure of the early church and how edgy it was, what they were doing, have we not missed that? Have we not lost that? And again, I would tell you we've lost it because is Jesus present with us in these local churches in modern Western world? I believe he's there. I don't believe we acknowledge him or acknowledge what he says about who we are to be. Now let's finally go to what we're going to call the matchless church, the matchless Ekklesia. I take you to Matthew 16. So if you were in Matthew 18, go back a couple pages. Matthew 16, and this is so cool. I'm so excited to share it with you. Starting in verse 13. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, okay, what is that? That's a town that was given into the area of Israel by Rome, okay? And it was originally called Peneus after the god Pan, okay? So Rome comes in and creates a city and says, we're going to do this in the name of a god, a cult. And then the Israelites changed the name to Philippi, Caesarea Philippi. We're not going to go into all the details about that. You can look that up. So they enter into this area, and he asks his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say I am? Simon Peter, often the spokesman for the whole group, replies, you are the Christ. Christ is not his last name. It's the word that means Messiah. So you're the promised one, the Son of the living God. That's quite a proclamation. So he says, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Now watch this. This is very cool. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my Ekklesia. There's the third and final time Jesus will talk about his Ekklesia. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So he uses that phrase again. What is going on there? He says, blessed are you. You are so fortunate that you get this. I tell you though, Peter, Petros, and that's the name he gave him, remember? Petros, the form of this word means little rock, little stone. I tell you, you little stone, that on this rock, Petra is the word he uses, which means a rocky mountain. They are just miles south in Caesarea Philippi. They can see from there Mount Hermon, which rises up 9,000 feet above sea level. And at its peak, it's usually snow-covered. And so I'm guessing he looks at that mountain and points to it and says, but upon this rock, upon this rocky mountain, I will build my Ekklesia. What is it? Well, of course, the Catholic Church always said, well, they're talking about Peter. Peter's the foundation of the church. No, because he calls out two different names. You, little rock, got it right. But my Ekklesia will be built on a rock like that, on a mountain like that. Isn't that cool? My Ekklesia has that kind of a foundation. What's he referring to? He's referring to what Peter said. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Two things are happening here. First of all, Jesus verifies his divinity. You're right. I am the Son of God. That's huge. Notice where he does it. He does it at the base of a huge mountain and says, and that confession, that reality is the foundation of my Ekklesia. He goes on to say, and I tell you, the gates of hell will not prevail against it. This is awesome. In Caesarea Philippi, there was actually a cave there called the gates of hell. And it's where the occult would gather and sacrifice humans and animals. It was just the very source of evil. It was the most evil area in all of Israel. Think about what Jesus is doing. And I got to tell you, you probably have noticed, we do our very best to film in places that are relevant to what we're talking about. I love that idea because I think that's what Jesus did a lot. a lot, right? I think he's doing it now. He's probably there pointing both to a mountain and the gates of hell, maybe pointing to that cave, saying the most evil spot in all of Israel cannot prevail against my Ekklesia. Isn't that awesome? In other words, my Ekklesia is matchless. It will run over even the very source of evil. That's important, obviously. Why? The modern Western church seems to be cowering. We seem to be living in fear of what's going on around us. It's so evil. And the evil, you can see it everywhere. I've pointed that out. We don't have to talk about it anymore. But it is the very face of evil. But Jesus stands probably at the opening of a cave, the mouth of a cave, and says, this is the source of evil as far as you guys know. And I tell you, not even this can stand up to what you're about to experience as my Ekklesia. So incredibly, Jesus only uses the word Ekklesia 3 times. But that word will be used over 120 times in the rest of the New Testament. So he is talking about his people who are called out. He's using a secular idea, infusing it with kingdom DNA. Although he didn't say Ekklesia very often, he talked about his kingdom all the time. So it's the values of the kingdom being inserted into a secular idea. And with that idea comes really the idea of mobility of his people, the idea of mysterious nature when they're together, that he's there with them even though they can't see him, and then the matchless influence and power of his people. Okay, and he does that last part in Caesarea Philippi, and he's also telling them something really important. You are now, as my people, not just on the move, not just experiencing some mysterious things, but you are entering into the spirit realm. You now will do battle at a level that you never have seen before. You've seen me do battle with demons. Now you are my people, and this will be a way of life. But don't fear. When you use my power, you will run over the gates of hell. Okay, so here we are in the upper room. It's kind of our 6-month checkup, is what it is. And the question is, how are we doing? How are we doing at this adjustment? At this adjustment from doing what's typically happening in the modern Western church to doing what we believe God's leading us to do based on what we know about the church in the New Testament. I want to go through a little exercise with you, and I'm going to go quickly into this. Okay? I'm not going to read these verses to you. I'm going to ask you to jot them down. We have notes available that you can get if you need these. But we're going to go through an exercise where we're going to look at, so what are the adjustments that we believe God wants us as the church to make? And what we're trying to do in the upper room is make those adjustments. The question is, how are we doing? Okay, I'm going to give you 11. Okay, 11 areas or topics where I believe God is asking us to just rethink it, reimagine it, rebrand. Okay, here we go quickly. Hope you're ready. Number 1, the modern church, the contemporary church, is seen as an organization. Jesus called us to be an organism, to be organic. John chapter 5 verses 4 through 8 talk about him being the vine. We are the branches. It is an organic kind of thing that should be going on in our relationship with him and in his Ekklesia. Okay, the second area where I believe we need to make some adjustments in the modern church are the idea of independence. The modern church is filled with people who are independent. I do what I want to do when I want to do it. I don't have to ask any permission. I don't have to do anything that connects with anybody else. I do it because it makes me feel good, all those kinds of things. Jesus, though, has called us to be interdependent on one another, okay? Not codependent, not so much that I can't live without somebody, but interdependent. Over 100 times the one another shows up. The one another phrase shows up in the New Testament. And there's so many, like John 13:34, where we are commanded one of 16 times to love one another. And in Romans 12:10, where we're called to be devoted to one another. It's an interdependent kind of thing. The third area we need to make some adjustments, and that is moving from a building, which is really the face of the church today. We go to church. That means we go to a building, and there's certain things we can and can't do in that building because we think it's the church. And instead, Jesus calls us to be a body. Let me give you some passages. 1 Corinthians 12:12 through 27. Ephesians 4:11 through 16. Grow. Ed Silvoso puts it this way: the Ekklesia was a building-less mobile people movement designed to operate 24/7 in the marketplace for the purpose of having an impact on everybody and everything. See, a moving, living body that is always alive, not just a sterile building, and we're having an impact on the marketplace. That's Ekklesia. It, in the Roman and Greek term, meant we meet in the marketplace. We gather, and that's what we're to do. As we go to do life amongst other people, we are a body that reaches in to even the marketplace of our society. The fourth idea is the idea that the modern church, the contemporary church, sees the importance of a place or an address. It kind of goes along with a building, but it actually is a location. It's not just, brick and mortar, but it's actually a location. Now, when I go to church, I talk about going to a location. Instead of it being a location, Jesus said his Ecclesia is a people. We're not a place, we're a people. And I have a good friend that we kid about this all the time, and he actually confronts people when they say, where do you go to church? He tells them, church is not a place, it's a people. 1 Peter 2, chapter 9 in the New American Standard and the New English Translation says, but you are a people. That's where he says you're a holy nation, a priesthood, but he says you are a people. It's as plain as day. We must make that adjustment. So when you gather as the upper room, you're gathering, you're the church when you gather, not because you're going to a place. I can't emphasize this enough, that we are a people. The church, the Ekklesia, is a people. That's what Jesus was saying when he used that word. I want to share from Kevin DeVries this quote. He says, there's only one trail to transformation: facing your trial or trouble with a tribe who tells the truth. Isn't that great? A tribe. We are a tribe. We are a group of people who tell the truth with one another. And that leads to transformation, especially in the face of trials and troubles. The fifth idea that we need to adjust in our mindset, we need that whack on the side of the head, is the idea of what's in it for me. What's in it for me? You saw those Barna Research statistics. People are largely a part of a church for what's in it for me, because I enjoy it. That's a mindset that we have to move out of to how can I help? How can I serve you? I am here. I have gathered today with this one primary reason, and that is to help and serve you, the rest of you. Philippians 2, 1 through 11 talks about how Jesus did that very thing. He came to earth, shedded his royalty, and took on the form of a man and a servant amongst men, and he considered himself of no consequence, humbled himself, became obedient to serve us, and become obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. He gave us the example. Number 6, the modern Western contemporary church is complicated. And believe me, after 35 years in the modern church, I could tell you hundreds of stories of how complicated it's become. When you look at the New Testament, it's rather simple. Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. We've gone over that. Go to the first lessons we did. It's a fairly simple thing. We gather and we do a few things together that bring us in the presence of Jesus together. Okay, the seventh idea, quickly as we move ahead, is the idea of passivity. The contemporary church is a place of passivity. You go in, you sit down, you listen, and you leave. You might sing if you want to. You don't have to, but you leave. You might evaluate. Most people evaluate the program, the show, but it's a place of passivity. And Christianity has become a passive thing we do. We let things come to us. It's about you giving me. The New Testament church was about being active. Galatians 5:13 speaks to this. It's something that I participate in, not something I passively just receive. And finally, number 8, this is big, and you probably have never thought this through, but let me throw it out to you. In the contemporary church, giving, I'm talking about giving of the resources you have, money or whatever resources God's given us, giving is something I do because the church needs it. Now think about that. The church is headed up by Jesus. What does Jesus need? Seriously. So when I transition out of that, I morph out of that, I adjust my thinking. I now give not because the church needs it, not because the upper room needs it. I give because I need. From Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 6, verse 19, even in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7, he implores us to give because I need to do that. Because my heart, and that's the essence of who I am, my heart follows my investment. So for me to invest in the kingdom, to invest in the Ekklesia, my heart will follow that. I'll be all in. When I put money in something, I follow it, right? You put money in the stock market, you start following the stock market. You put money into a horse race, you're going to follow what happens in that horse race. You put your money into the kingdom, which means that money will be multiplied and will have eternal consequences. Your heart follows it. Don't give of the resources God's loaned to you because you think somebody needs it necessarily. Give because you need it. I need to give. So my heart becomes a kingdom heart, which leads us to number 9, and that is I'm willing in this contemporary culture of church to give a part of me. I'll give you a part of me. I'll measure off a little 10th of my life or 12th of my life or whatever it is and give that to you. Jesus did not implore us to give a part of my life. He said, make it the priority of your life. Honestly, I know very few people where the kingdom, the Ekklesia, is the priority of their life. Matthew 6:33 from the Sermon on the Mount, seek first the kingdom of God. How do you do that? The kingdom of God is being lived out by His Ecclesia. And then all the rest of the things will take care of themselves, Jesus said. Also in Acts 2:42 through 47, as we've mentioned before, the priority is that they met daily. The Ekklesia, it was their life. It wasn't a small part of their life. And I want to ask you pointedly, is your participation in the Ekklesia, is it just a little part of your life, or is it the priority of your life? Number 10 is that the common church today is culturally driven. We've done a lot of work on that, how we are tempted to make the church reflect the culture instead of reflect the head. And in being culturally driven, it's about my satisfaction. It's about my desires being met. It's about how satisfied I am, and that's what those Barna research numbers tell us. So how do we adjust from that? We adjust from that by saying we will not be culturally driven. We will be Christ-centered. We'll put Him back where He belongs as the head, as the most important thing. Because when a head is chopped off of a chicken, it lives for a little bit. It can even look good, like Mike, for 18 months. But it doesn't last very long. To be Christ-centered is, as 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 1 through 6 says, I am not going to look to a man. I'm not going to make a celebrity out of a man. I am going to make Jesus the focus. People like myself are just fallen individuals who've been given a gift to relay, communicate what God's Word says. I am not the celebrity of the church. Only Jesus. Only Jesus. Christ-centered. And so number 10, being culturally driven, is a lot like number 11. And yet I want to go further with it. 11 is being self-seeking. All right? We in the modern church are predominantly self-seeking. What's in it for me? How much do I like it? What are you doing for me lately? Are you making me happy? Jesus called us instead to be self-denying. And that element has to re-enter the church. And it will when Jesus becomes the head, because we'll look to Him and say, how do you want us to live? And He says in Matthew chapter 16, verses 24 through 26, you must deny yourself, take up your cross daily, and follow me. You must do that. Okay, so that's our little tour of the adjustments I think need to be made in the current church, the modern Western church, the adjustments we're trying to make, doing our very best to make in the upper room. I'd be interested in hearing from the leaders of your discussions how this discussion went. It's a difficult one, but it's worthwhile. I want to wrap things up by talking about a guy by the name of Abel Matai. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's a long-distance runner from Kenya, and those are the best long-distance runners by far. And he has won some world championships. He's elite when it comes to long-distance running. His specialty is the steeplechase. He was running not too long ago in a cross-country race where he was just yards from the finish line, but he became confused. The signage didn't make sense to him, and he slowed down, and then he eventually stopped. Behind him, several yards behind him, was a Spaniard by the name of Ivan Fernandez. And Fernandez could tell what was happening, so he started yelling at him as to where he was supposed to be running, but Mutai didn't know Spanish, and so it made no sense to him. You know what happened? You can see this. You can look this up on YouTube. It's awesome. Fernandez stops, grabs him by the back of the shirt, and pushes him towards the finish line in front of him. Amazing, amazing. You can bet afterwards he was asked about that. Why? The media said, why in the world? You had the chance to beat this guy, to be victorious. Why in the world would you push him across the finish line in front of you? Choose to lose. Let me read to you what Fernandez says. It's beautiful. He says this: my dream is that someday we can have a kind of community life where we push and help each other to win. My dream, a community. Doesn't that sound like Jesus? My dream is that my people, my community, will not be considering how important things are to them and whether or not they're having their way, but they are willing to push others up in front of them across the finish line. They are wanting them to experience all that I have for them. That's the kind of community I dream of. The media would not stop hounding this Fernandez guy, and finally said, we just don't understand. You could have won. You could have a medal. And he then said this: what would my mom think of that? Isn't that great? What would my mom think of that? As his Ekklesia, our response is, what does my father think of this? What would he think of how I'm treating those around me? See, that's the difference maker. We're to be mobile. There's a mysterious nature to our life together, and certainly it's a matchless life that Jesus offers us. Let's not be Mike. Let's not run around with our head cut off. Let's look to the head, stay attached to the head, live for Him, to please Him. So glad you're part of the Upper Room.